Hello and welcome to the EduCast Biology revision session on pressure changes in the heart. So today what we are going to talk about are the pressure changes in the heart. We'll start by talking about the cardiac cycle and the anatomy of the heart. As we can see, we have the four chambers of the heart, the two atria, the two ventricles. You've got your atrioventricular valves, as well as your veins and arteries entering and leaving the heart. So if we start from the vena cava, we have the superior and inferior vena cava entering the right atrium. From here, blood goes to the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve, entering the right ventricle and leaving the right ventricle via the pulmonary valve. This is because the pulmonary artery takes blood away from the heart, and although it is an artery, it is important to note that it carries deoxygenated blood. The reason why it is deoxygenated is because blood has not yet reached the lungs, where they will undergo oxygenation, where the blood will be oxygenated and re-enter the heart via the pulmonary vein, this time entering from the left atrium. As it enters the left atrium, blood is then sent to the left ventricle via the mitral valve, and here, from the left ventricle, which has a thicker muscle, blood is pumped to the rest of the body in the systemic circulation. The circulation of blood going from the right side of the heart to the lungs is classed as the pulmonary circulation. So, when talking about pressure changes in the heart, it is very important to know the atrioventricular valves open when the pressure of the blood in the atria is more than that of the ventricles. They close when the pressure of the blood in the ventricles is greater than that in the atria. And that is a key thing to note, as of course we have a change in pressure and a rise in pressure that leads to a pressure gradient. And when there is a pressure gradient, blood flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So if we follow the cycle, or the cardiac cycle, or what we call the pressure changes in the heart, we notice here, initially, we have atrial systole. This is the atrial contraction of the heart, leading to emptying of the atria, filling of the ventricles. So as you can see here, and the dotted line here shows that the ventricular pressure is rising as the ventricles are being filled, and eventually they reach a point where the ventricular pressure is so high that it causes outward flow of blood, and this obviously correlates to ventricular systole, when the walls of the ventricles contract, causing a steep rise in pressure, leading to this steep curve coming all the way over. As the ventricles contract, blood leaves the ventricles, and this is the downward slope in pressure, this dotted line, as blood leaves the ventricles. If we focus on just the left side of the heart, this would correlate to left atrial contraction initially, followed by left ventricular contraction, the thick muscled wall that contracts and sends blood round to the systemic circulation, leading to this area here. It's very important to note what is going on here. This is the closure of the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves, of course, correlate to the valve in the aorta on the left side, or the valve in the pulmonary artery on the right side of the heart. So this is where the semilunar valves close. As they close, it is because now the pressure in the aorta has increased, and blood is now being pumped around to the rest of the body, as that aortic pressure also now drops. As the semilunar valves close, the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower and lower, drastically drops down, eventually reaching a point where the pressure in the left ventricle, or the right ventricle, is now less than the pressure in the aorta, in the atria. So the left ventricular pressure here is less than the pressure in the left atria as it drops lower, and this causes opening of a certain valve, the valve between the ventricle and the atria, called atrioventricular valves, also known as the mitral and tricuspid valves. And eventually we have the period of relaxation of the heart known as diastole. This is one of the key diagrams to learn when it comes to pressure changes in the heart, and it can be quite easily understood by following the cardiac cycle, focusing on one side of the heart. My tip is to follow the left side of the heart, and the same would correlate with the right side as well. So how would blood pressure change in the vessels? So first of all, it's important to know what blood pressure is. This refers to the pressure within the vessels carrying the blood around the body. Now this can either fluctuate or it can remain generally constant, but commonly in the five sort of areas of different vasculature in the body, it is really important to know the structure of the veins, the venules, capillaries, arterioles and arteries. And as we can see here, we've got a breakdown of each one. We have the arteries that carry the highest pressure, have the highest pressure. Why do they have the highest pressure? It all goes back to the sort of structure of the arteries with a narrow lumen and a thick tunica intima media. As you can note from here, you have a rhythmic rise and fall, and this correlates to ventricular contraction, where you have your rise, your systolic blood pressure, also known as your SBP, and then you have your fall when the ventricles relax, because this correlates with relaxation, so the pressure in the blood vessels is also relaxed during this point. This correlates to your diastolic blood pressure. So as you probably remember from going to the doctors, there are always two readings for blood pressure. The number on the top, the number on the bottom, almost looks like a fraction. The top number or the numerator correlates to the systolic blood pressure, and the denominator correlates to diastolic blood pressure, referring to blood pressure in the arteries. In the arterioles, we have a slight drop in blood pressure. As you notice, there is friction with the vessel walls because of systemic vascular resistance, which causes where the narrow lumen now causes a substantial decrease in the pressure. It's almost like forcing a massive queue of people from a stadium, outside a stadium, entering, say, Old Trafford Football Club via the turnstiles. The pressure on the outside is intense and it's quite high, and it's higher than inside the stadium, because now you're passing through the turnstiles. The friction of the turnstiles causes a queue to build up, but also the pressure to drop. So there's not as much pressure from behind because one person is entering at a time. We then move on to the capillaries, vessels with much smaller diameters, where the friction of the walls slows the blood flow and drastically decreases the blood pressure. Fluid can be forced out of the capillaries, which are 1 cell thick, into the tissues, and this further reduces blood pressure, blood flow in the capillaries. Then we have the veins and venules. In the veins, this is essentially where we have to really understand the structure of veins. They have valves, they have thin walls, and there is no sort of pulsating rhythm or rhythmic movement to veins. So this non-rhythmic movement is responsible for return of blood flow to the heart, and essentially the main sort of mechanism that allows blood flow, for example in the legs, to return to the heart is the skeletal muscle massaging effect, where you have your skeletal muscles, for example, let's say your gastrocnemius, your calf muscle, compressing the veins in your legs and almost causing them to compress the blood back up to the heart. Almost like your hand when you're compressing a toothpaste tube and squeezing the toothpaste so that it comes out the top and onto your toothbrush. In the same way, these muscles are compressing against the veins and forcing blood to move upwards against the force of gravity, heading back towards your heart.